evening, everyone. Welcome to the Monroe County History Center. Okay, is that better? We hope you've enjoyed visiting with each other, looking at the exhibits upstairs, especially John's photography exhibit, and enjoying some of the refreshments. Do feel free to get up during the program this evening if you want another drink or you can't resist another cookie. Okay, please help yourselves. Recipes, by the way, are from our recent cookbook, The Tastes of Monroe County. And so if you had something tonight that was especially good, you might want to pick up one of those books from our store. Tonight's program is one in our series of Third Thursday programs, and we're pleased to have photographer John Bauer here with us. This is the third time that we have exhibited his photography here at the center, and it has always been very well received. I'm sure that you agree that his thought-provoking photographs not only beautifully document his subjects, but his work actually seems to capture their spirit. Usually, well, this was not true tonight though, but usually visitors in the galleries talk to each other as they look around, but in John's gallery, there is usually silence. And it's a respectful, almost religious silence, as each viewer is alone with his or her thoughts. John holds a Bachelor of Science degree from Purdue University and a Master of Arts in Education from Ball State. He has had many of his photographs featured in books and periodicals and has exhibited very widely in Indiana. John's program tonight is entitled Capturing the Soul of Indiana, a celebration of our overlooked cultural heritage. I'm sure you will enjoy John Bauer.
Very good. Thank you very much, Allison. I don't want to pull this over. Is that dark enough? Would it help if some of the lights were down a little bit? You think, can we turn them down just a little? Maybe some of the fluorescence? There's 6 people going to turn the light switch down.
Wow, you're powerful. I think you're the only one who knows which ones are which.
7.
Lighting is all brand new in here. It's just been here for a week or so. So we're trying to show it off.
If you can just leave the last row on. How's that? It's better? Okay. Several years ago, I was showing a friend of ours some of my photographs, and there was a variety of things there. There were things like this little one-room school, houses and barns and vehicles and old stores. And she looked at them and she said, "Why are you taking so many pictures of things that are falling apart?" And I didn't realize I was, but they were. Even though it was a variety of subjects, they were all falling apart. And one of the reasons is because they won't be here very long. In fact, this little school was knocked down this last summer, and they're recycling the bricks for something. It stood like that for several years, just valiantly being held up, but it's not there anymore. This is a site of a little store in a little southern Indiana town, and we drove by here several times hoping to find some old men sitting in these chairs, but we never could. They were always empty. And you know, they're there for a reason. The last time we went through this town, I said, "Isn't this where that store is?" And Lynn said, "Yeah, it's where that lot is now." So this was torn down. Now, most of these places don't have any really strong historical value except to the local people. They mean something to them. Sometimes we'll find something that does have some really pretty important historical value. This is Quartermaster's Quadrangle. It was built as a supply depot just after the Civil War. And this building is like 2 blocks on a side. So it's quite a large thing, and it's open in the center. There's a courtyard with a couple of buildings in there, and then this ring of brick warehouse space around the perimeter. And you know, these round-topped windows go all the way down. Those have been boarded up. But some of this got knocked down in a storm a while back, and so they finally decided that they might restore some of it to make into office space or something.
Excuse me, could you tell us where these buildings are as you show them?
This is in New Albany.
How about that schoolhouse?
The schoolhouse is just north of Morgantown, or it was.
Just curious.
And the little store, I can never remember the town. I think it's Livonia, but I'm not positive. But the real reason I take these pictures is because I'm a do-it-yourselfer. This is a house my wife and I built for ourselves. You know, we didn't hire contractors to do this. We poured the foundation, we pounded nails, we laid the flooring, we made the cabinets, we finished it, finished the drywall, did the roofing. We did it all. And I think it's a very human thing to work with your hands and make things. And virtually everything I take pictures of has got that human touch. It was made by hand. Now, even an automobile that's 50 years old, you can say, well, that was made on an assembly line. But it was assembled with human hands. It wasn't assembled with robots. So I've got a real feeling for some of these old places. Most of them I don't know anything about because a lot of them are abandoned. This is in a barn up by Fort Wayne, and it was a girl I went to college with. She married a good friend of mine, and they were selling this property. It was her grandfather's property, and it had been in the family for 100 years. And I said, well, you know, that high chair I just took a picture of, was that yours? And she's like in her 50s, same age I am. She said, well, my uncle sent that to Grandma to use for when we were little, when the grandkids were over. And she didn't like it because the legs splayed out so much. She kept tripping over it. So she put it out in the barn 50 years ago. And it's been sitting there for 50 years. And I said, well, what about those milk buckets? Which I assumed were milk buckets because there's a milk can here and there were other milk cans in the barn. So those aren't milk buckets, those are maple syrup buckets. Those have been sitting there since before World War II. So some of these places are like time capsules. They've just been sitting forever. This is in the little town of Center Point in the middle of Clay County. And you got to wonder how long that vine has been growing behind that siding. Coming out here. This house is abandoned and closed up, yet they mow all the way around it, and they trim except for the vine. You know, there's no weeds, it's just mowed grass, but you got to give that vine credit. That is going to eat that entire house one of these days. Well, my wife and I, up until a few years ago, we wrote and published books on indoor air quality. And we had done several books and videos and different editions. And we were trying to decide what our next book would be, whether it would be a new edition of one we'd already done or a brand new book. And we were really getting kind of tired of this. We'd written about 1 million words, and that was all we really cared to say. So she suggested we do a book of photos, of black and white photography that I'd been taking. So we did. We decided to take 10 south central Indiana counties and drive on every road in those counties. We got 10 maps at each courthouse, and we just started marking roads off as we drove. Dead-end roads, all kinds of roads. We covered about 15,000 miles looking for fading, forlorn, and forgotten places. And that resulted in this book. Can't see it very well, but there's a Singer sewing machine hanging out of that window. This is down in Jackson County, and we had driven around for probably about 3 hours this morning and hadn't seen hardly anything worth taking a picture of. And we came around a bend in the road and saw that house up on a hill, and I said, that's the cover for the book. And the house fell down about 2 months after I shot it, as did the trees. So it's all just down now. But we went back there a few months ago to take some pictures of the rubble, which isn't really very interesting looking. And a guy living next door whose grandparents lived in that house, I was talking to him and I said, well, did anybody get the sewing machine? And he said, no, it's in there somewhere. You see a lot of abandoned vehicles, but these are just like buddies. You know, it's the only time I've seen two alike. Now, I don't know if they cloned them or if, you know, the husband had one and the wife wanted one just like it, or if they bought one for spare parts or what. But I think this is a dogwood tree growing up between them, which is a pretty slow growing tree. So they've been there a long time. And you'd hate to separate them now. It'd be like splitting up twins and, you know, taking them apart. There was an abandoned house that had a trailer next to it, and I was going to take some pictures of this old house, and so I went up to the trailer to ask permission. I always ask permission if there's somebody to ask, but there isn't always somebody to ask. In this case, this guy came to the door, a guy in his 60s in his jockey shorts. And I explained what I was going to do, and he said, yeah, take some pictures. And he said, now, I collect brass steam whistles. Let me get you one. So he came out with this whistle about 2 feet long. It didn't look like much, just a hunk of brass. And he brought it out in his yard, and he set it by the tree, and he said, now take a picture of that. So I humored him. I took a picture of his whistle. I never did make a print of it. But he starts talking about this house that's down the road and back a lane. You can't see it from the road. And he said nobody lived in it for 50 years. So he's talking about this place, and I knew Lynn was probably wondering where I was, and she was waiting in the car. All of a sudden I saw her come around this abandoned house, and she sees me talking to this guy out in his yard in his jockey shorts. And she just kind of shook her head and turned around and went back to the car like there wasn't anything unusual about this. But this is the house that he told us about. He said it hadn't been lived in 50 years. There were clothes in the closets. There were mattresses on the beds. The furniture was all there. It wasn't in very good shape because the roof was starting to go, so the weather was getting in. There's a penny postcard on the seat here. And there were a whole bunch of these scattered around on the floor. They were all addressed to this address, and on the back side, you could tell it was for a burial insurance fund. And it had a place for a person's name. And they wrote in the name, so-and-so had died. Please send $1 into the fund. So these cards kept coming here, and whenever somebody had died, you know, a new card would come, and this person would send $1 into the fund, and the fund would pay for that person's burial. Well, you know, the card stopped one day when this person died. And it's been the same for the last 50 years. The cards are still there, the furniture's there. You know, it's amazing what you can find. About midway through this project, I applied to the Indiana Arts Commission to get an individual artist grant to help pay for publishing a book. And their grants at the time were up to $1,000, which isn't enough to pay for publishing a book, but I'm not one to turn down $1,000, and this is a nice pat on the back. I've since gotten 2 of these grants. And if you know anybody that does anything in the arts at all, whether it's photography or painting or dance or singing or poetry, about 25 to 50% of the people that apply for these grants get them. So it's really pretty decent odds. It's better odds than playing the lottery. And all you got to do is fill out some forms. You don't have to put up any money. This place, I asked, there was a ranch house next door to this, and I asked permission to take some pictures here. And the woman said, well, we don't own that property. You got to go a quarter mile up the road. So I went up the road, and I talked to this woman, and she said, oh, I know the house you mean. I thought you meant the old house. And there was, in fact, one that was older than this. And I hadn't seen it, but this one was a little more picturesque. And there were some cows walking around here, but they took off as soon as I went over the fence. but you can kind of tell where the grass is fertilized from the cow pies. Now, you know they parked that car there to protect it from the weather. You know, I can just hear somebody. Yeah, Charlie, get that car in the garage. It's going to hail. I contacted Judy O'Bannon to write the foreword for my book. I didn't meet her actually face-to-face until last week, and this book came out about 4 years ago. But talking to her press secretary and conversing with her through email and phone calls, she really understood what I was doing, because she goes around to abandoned houses and maybe I'll pick up an old brick and take it home because she knows it's got a lot of memories associated with it, and then she'll put that brick by her barn or something. But she needed to know when my deadline was, and I gave her a date, and I got the foreword just in time, and it was about 2 weeks before the governor died. So it was one of the last things she did as First Lady. This was an old fire truck over here in Brown County near Gnawbone. And look how long it's been sitting there. It's sunk down in the ground. This had a big plywood sign leaning up against it. And the sign said, "For sale," hand-painted letters. And the sign would blow down in the wind, and about 2 months later, somebody'd lean it up again. You know, they really weren't serious about selling this thing, but finally, it was gone not too long ago. Somebody must have bought it. And my first thought was it'd be kind of neat to see that all painted up and shiny with the bumper chromed and all. But the more I thought about it, I like it like this. This is how I want to remember it. I think it's got more character. It just wouldn't be right to be shiny again. It's like taking a picture of a little boy all dressed up in a suit. You know, that's not an everyday outfit for that little boy. It's not right. You know, you take a picture of a little boy with a black eye and his hair messed up and mud on his face. You know, that's how you need to remember him. If you drive around enough, it's amazing what you can find. It's an old trolley car sitting in the woods over in Brown County. And again, this is another dogwood tree. It's a slow-growing tree. That's been sitting there a long time. And it's not even very close to any railroad tracks. Somebody has there's some like wooden framed windows leaning up against it. I don't know if somebody was going to make it into a house or what. Doesn't have any seats in it anymore, but it's still got the headlight, but it's broken. This is in a 2-room house. And the house is probably not a whole lot bigger than this stage. A little bitty house. And that stove just dominates the kitchen. And I think about when that stove arrived. First of all, how many people it took to lug it in there. You know, more than 2, I'm sure. And how proud they were, because that was a marvel. You know, it's still a marvel. It's an amazing piece of equipment. Somebody asked me to tell them where this was so they could go steal it, and I wouldn't tell them, because I would rather the house fell down around it and it just died a natural death than somebody made a few dollars off of it. To me, these places are memorials. They're just like a gravestone memorial. They're a record of the people that lived here. You know, I think of not only the people that lived here, the people that built the house, and maybe even the banker who had the first mortgage on this house. There's just all kinds of people involved with these places, and they've all got stories to tell, but they'll never be told. So we can make up stories. It's a little Catholic church down in Perry County near the Ohio River. And I was taking a picture of the steeple, and Lynn was walking around, and she said, "The door's unlocked, it's wide open, you can go inside and take pictures." So I got up in the choir loft and took a picture of the altar. And I was showing these slides down in Jasper, and a guy came up afterwards, and he said, "I'm retired now, but I used to be the priest in that church." And I said, "Well, how long has it been empty?" He said, "Oh, about 20 years. Just been sitting there." You know, an old wooden clapboard church. The last time I was by there, they started putting vinyl siding on it. Well, you know, it's nice that they're going to save it, but couldn't they have just painted it? Why is it on the porch? This is one of those things, we could all come up with a different story. My favorite was one my sister said, just after she got divorced. So, well, it was the husband's piano, and he was running around, and she threw him out with the piano. It certainly doesn't play well anymore. This was another place that had clothes in the closets and furniture all over. And there wasn't another house within 5 miles of here. There was no power lines on the road, but there was dishes set up on the kitchen table and some toy dolls. So I'm guessing that whoever farmed the area brought his daughters with him, and they played in the house while he worked in the fields. But other than that, it's just been sitting here for a long time. And I'm sure that if you plug that TV in, you'd get Howdy Doody. This is a limestone mill just south of town here. And the way these work, these are saw blades here, and this whole carriage moves back and forth to saw down through these blocks. And these blocks are about this high. Now, I don't know how long it takes to saw all the way through there, but it seems to me that before they started that day, somebody knew they were going to close the plant at the end of the day. And yet they let them saw halfway through, and then they said, okay, we're closing the plant, everybody go home. It doesn't make sense. This building is as big as a football field, and there's all this old, expensive equipment in there. It's not expensive anymore because it's rusting away. But it's amazing that people would just leave something like that and walk away from it. The equipment's worth something, at least for scrap value even. We found several sawmills. This is the only one that still had the saw blade. I think somebody takes the blades and paints barns on them. But the vertical posts here and the rafters are round logs. They're not sawn boards. So they either made the structure before they had the sawmill and dragged it under it, or they were too cheap to saw boards for their own structure. So it's like the cobbler's kids going barefoot. Now, this is the last picture in this book. This is a round dome structure. It's off of 446, just south of town. And I thought it was a silo. It's surrounded by woods, so you can't see it at all when the leaves are out. You can only see it in the winter. But I went to investigate and found out that it was an abandoned observatory. And this domed roof, you could see the mechanism, how it used to be able to rotate so they could point it in different directions so the telescope could look in different directions at the sky. The roof door is starting to open now, so the weather's getting in and rotting the floor. But I thought, this building was designed to use an instrument, a telescope, to look at light from the past. Because the light from stars takes so long to get to us, by the time we see it, it's light from the past. And that's what I was doing in this book. I was using an instrument, a camera, to capture the light from objects of the past, to illuminate them, to show them to people. So this is really, this ended up being one of the last pictures in the book. Well, as we were working on this, we didn't know where we would be when it got to be lunchtime. So we'd take a lunch with us, and we'd often eat in a cemetery, because cemeteries are nice and quiet and peaceful, and there's usually some neat tombstones to look at. This particular one is down by Valonia, and it's on a hill in the middle of a field. Nice fence around it, a small cemetery. You can't get to it when there's crops in the field. There's no road or anything, so you got to wait till the crops are cut before you can get up to it. So we didn't eat in this one, but it's really a neat cemetery. And as we saw these cemetery statues, we decided that most people don't even know they exist, that we ought to do a book of cemetery statues. And we found a number of them just randomly driving around. So we decided our second book would be cemetery statues. This one is on the south side of Indianapolis, and it's half life-size, so it's only about this high. It's up on a pedestal. But it's just the most amazingly delicate carving. These things We found a few metal ones, but most of them are stone. So they're all hand carved, and they could fit in any museum in the country. We found 600 statues in southern Indiana cemeteries. I got leads from county historians and morticians and grave diggers and anybody I could think to call that would know about cemeteries in the area, I called. And we have since been back to a lot of these general areas, and we've only found maybe a half a dozen statues that we missed when we were doing this project. So we got most of them. Now, one of the things that I found was really sad was when I'd call a mortician, and he'd say, well, I go into cemeteries every day, but I never look around. I don't pay attention. I thought, it's just a job to this guy. You know, it's not a passion like people used to be passionate about their jobs. I just found that kind of sad, that they didn't even notice the beautiful sculpture that was right around them. Like this little angel is only about 2 feet high. Just a beautiful carving. This one's marble. It's in a Quaker cemetery, the Friends Cemetery. This is down in Lawrence County in a little country cemetery. This little girl with her hand on her hip, she's holding a dove in her other hand. I just thought that stance, she just looks like she doesn't take any crap from anybody. When I've had people say that, you know, these statues give them the creeps, it reminds them of death. But to me, this is love. You don't erect something like this to somebody you didn't care about. You only put up a statue to somebody you really, really had some feelings for. Now, even when they start getting eroded, you can see the skill of the people that carve these. They're just all one of a kind. For the most part, the statues were not vandalized. This one particular cemetery is down near Tell City. It's a little Catholic cemetery, and there were, I think, 6 or 7 statues in it, and they were all broken. And it was all overgrown, so there just wasn't any money to take care of it or put them back together. But I thought this little angel was really poignant with the wings broken off and the head set back on there. If you look at statues on courthouse lawns, they're almost always men. But the statues in cemeteries are mostly women. And the ones that are men are usually soldiers. So of the 600 statues we found, there were only, I think, 3 that were adult, full-sized men, civilians. And this one was my favorite. There was actually a statue of his wife there, too. He had commissioned the statue of her when she died, and it's kind of a stylized statue. I couldn't imagine it was a real realistic version of her. But anyway, he liked the statue well enough that he sent a picture of himself to Italy to have one of himself carved. And he died before it got here, so he never saw his own statue. But this is down by Crothersville, and you know, everybody knows these statues because it's a real flat place and they stand up and they're really prominent. But somebody knocked him over a couple Halloweens ago and broke him into 4 pieces. And everybody got so upset they raised a couple of $1,000s overnight to get some professional restorers to put him back together. So Elijah's in good shape again. We found a number of animals. The lions are in pairs usually. This one's marble, but he just looked like he had the weight of the world on his shoulders. You know, all the lichen and stuff growing on these things really gives them character. But we found a cat and a couple of 3/4 size horses, a couple of geese and some dogs. My wife usually goes with me. She not only keeps me company, she watches for things while I'm trying to keep my eyes on the road. But for the cemetery statues, she would have a reflector to reflect the light on it just right, because you can't ask a statue to turn a little bit, you know, to get the right light. Well, she was busy this day, and this is over by the Ohio line. And I knew there were 2 statues in the cemetery because someone had told me, but I didn't know which way they faced. And it was real late in the afternoon, and they just happened to be facing west. Now with black and white film, you can use a red filter and it'll make the blue sky really dark. And it really wasn't this dark out, but it was a perfectly blue sky. And the statue was up on a pedestal, so we always had an 8-foot step ladder, and I have a mount on the top for my camera, so I've got like an 8-foot high tripod. So I was up on the ladder with the camera and the red filter and the setting sun, and it just came out perfect that I was able to get that by myself. It's a life-size statue. This one was just the opposite. It had the sun on the backside, and she had a reflector to shine light on this little girl, and the wind caught the reflector just as I snapped the shutter. So I got a second shot, but I liked the first one better. I just thought it had a different kind of appearance with just a little bit of light on her face. This is kind of a popular design. We saw maybe 6 or 8 or 10 of these statues as little girls, maybe about so high, all different slightly because they're all hand carved, but just dropping some flower petals. This is another kind of standard design. We probably saw maybe a dozen or so of this style. But sometimes she'd be resting her chin on her right hand and sometimes on her left hand, and maybe the flowers would be on her lap, or maybe she'd be holding them down on her side. Because, you know, if I was a sculptor and I would carve something, I wouldn't do the same thing over again. I'd do some kind of a variation. But this one's kind of unusual in that it's granite. There are not a lot of granite statues because it's so much harder to carve. They're mostly limestone and marble. This little girl is life-size. She's about 5 feet high. And the fellow that wrote the foreword for this, his name's Claude Cookman. He teaches photography at IU. And he shared in the Pulitzer Prize when he worked at the Louisville paper. And he's got quite an art background, so I thought he was a good person to write a foreword for this. And when he saw this picture, he saw something that I didn't notice, that her leg is just slightly bent, like she's just getting ready to step forward, you know, step forward into the future, into the unknown. But just, you know, the details like that just an everyday sculpture wouldn't think to do that. This is my wife. She not only suggested that we do these books, she keeps a lot of notes on a laptop computer while we're driving around and keeps me from driving in the ditch. But she also designs the books. She's a graphic artist. So she is really good at critiquing my work. And she'll make the final selection of images that'll go in the book. Granted, I've got a little bit of say in it, but I tend to trust her in doing this because she'll maybe spend a couple of hours doing a rough layout and then agonize over it for about 2 or 3 weeks because each facing page has to look good with the other page, and then pages have to follow well. So, you know, sequentially, even though there may not be any words there, the pictures flow. So these books would not be possible without her. I've never understood why you have to lock up graves. But this is a mausoleum, and there's a whole bunch of graves behind here, and this says Jimmy here. This is down in Salem, and everybody in the area knows about the little girl at the gate. She's about 4 feet high, a life-size little girl. And the story that goes with this is that this little girl used to wait at the gate for her daddy to come home for lunch and supper. And one day he came home and she wasn't there. She was sick in bed, and she died a couple days later. Well, the father was a stone carver, and he was so distraught and depressed that he couldn't do his work. And there happened to be an itinerant stone carver passing through town, and he took over the father's job and got his work done and brought everything up to date. And after a while, the father started feeling a little better and started going back to work and doing his job again. And this itinerant stone carver went on to some other town, and nobody knows his name. But he left the little girl at the gate. He's the one that carved it. Most of the religious statues are kind of standard depictions. But I really like this one. This was about half-life size because of the way the sculptors used a real long face on him. I just thought it was really kind of an interesting sculpture. You know, even without his hand broken off and the erosion on his face, it's just an amazing piece of sculpture. You know, I know little boys back then had a bow like that when they got all dressed up, but I just can't imagine he wore that every day. You know, if he went to my school, he'd have gotten beat up. This is in town of Washington. It's an old cemetery. It's real hilly and a lot of stones in it. And there were two high school kids mowing the cemetery with weed whackers. And I asked them how long they'd been at it, and they said 10 weeks. And they weren't done yet. Casper the Friendly Ghost. Now that's only about 2 inches high. This is one of my favorites. This is over in Edinburgh. You know, the high-top lace-up shoes and holding the flowers on her lap, and the wind is blowing the bow in her hair, and she's just sitting there staring off. You know, I just don't think about the fact that she's dead now. I think about how much love she brought to somebody, that they went to the trouble of having a statue made to remember her. I saw an article that mentioned the cost of one of these statues. And it wasn't this one, but it was a life-size statue, and it was like $1,400 about 100 years ago. That was enough to buy a house 100 years ago. So it wasn't cheap then. It's just something that they did then that they don't do today. And it's kind of sad that we don't have a tradition like this now. Now, granted, they probably had funerals at home, so they didn't have to pay a funeral home. They could spend the money on a statue instead. But it's just sad we don't have these kinds of traditions anymore. That's me. I use film. I like working in a dark room because I'm a hands-on kind of person. You can get darkroom equipment real cheap these days because everybody else is going to digital. To me, a real photograph made in a darkroom compared to a digital print that comes off an inkjet printer is like comparing a typed letter to a letter coming out of a laser printer. Now, there's just something more real about it and more handmade about it. That it just seems there's something more. There's more energy in it or something. So I still work in a darkroom. Well, as we were driving around southern Indiana looking for cemetery statues, we started visiting little towns we hadn't been to before. And we've always looked up at buildings to look at some of the architectural details. And we thought, well, now that would be kind of a neat book. Things you have to look up in the air to see. So, as with the cemetery book, for this one, we divided the state at US 40, this is the national road, and decided to drive through every single town in southern Indiana. There are 912 of them on our map, and we crossed off every one of them. So far, we've hit about half the towns in northern Indiana. We're working on them. But Michael Atwood, who is the host of Across Indiana on public television, wrote the foreword for this. And he really got into that because he's been to a lot of these little towns and seen a lot of the same things that we were seeing. But these are things that are upstairs, on top, and overhead. This is a courthouse stairway in Franklin. This bell is in the Monroe County Courthouse. Now, if you go up where this bell is, the dome is round, so there's a round walkway around the inside of it. And in the center of the walkway, you got to walk over a 2x12 plank is the clock mechanism. And there's 4 shafts that come out of the clock and go to the different clock faces. So here's a clock face. Well, when you look down from this railing, you can look down on the stained glass dome that you see if you're in the rotunda looking up. So we were above that, yet below the roof. And I was setting up my camera, getting a careful shot here of the bell when it went off. Now that bell is almost 2 feet in diameter, and I thought we had been bombed. it was so loud, I was just shaking for a minute until I could figure out what had happened. And I looked over at the maintenance guy who'd let us up there, and he was just standing there very cool and calm and collected. I kind of think he takes people up there as an initiation, but it may have been that he's just heard it often enough that he didn't hear it anymore. It's like, you know, you live next to the railroad, you don't hear the train. You just get used to it. But we just looking up, finding really interesting buildings. This is down in Gibson County. It's like a 3-story building right on the courthouse square. Nobody uses the upper floors anymore. But if you go to buy bricks today, you can get maybe 1 or 2 shapes. But you just look at all the different shapes of bricks, you know, they've used to make that. You couldn't possibly build something like that today. And if a corporation was involved, they wouldn't even have considered it, because a corporation is an entity for making profit. But you know, this was done by an individual, and they didn't mind spending a little extra because it was their building. They were proud of it. They wanted something to be proud of. They wanted something a little extra. I don't know if this building will be saved for posterity, but I can't imagine a lot of the buildings being built today being saved. You know, there's just nothing special about them. You know, that just says, I'm a jewelry store. You know, the guy that built that wanted something special, and he didn't mind spending a little extra for it. People just don't do that today. They're too interested in making a profit. And there's nothing wrong with making a profit. I'd like to be able to make a profit one of these days, but there's just something about some of these old buildings that they're just incomparable to what's being built today. If you've come across the bridge from Louisville, you've seen this clock. It's the Colgate-Palmolive building. And I found out this used to be a reformatory before they moved in. And they're going to be leaving in a couple of years, but I hear that the clock stays. Now, if you look at the front door and see how high a person would be, you can get an idea of just how huge that clock is. I met a woman whose father, or whose grandfather, wound it before it was electrified. And then her father was the electrician who electrified it. But the hands on that clock don't move smoothly. You know, they go, and then it stops. And then in a minute, kind of rocks into position. And then another minute, it kind of rocks into position. So it goes and kind of starts. If you tell people you're working on a book and you'd like to look in their attic, it's amazing how many people will let you do that. And I actually was working on a book. But this is the Soldiers and Sailors Children's Home. It's built during the Civil War for veterans' children. It's over in Henry County. And this is a 3 or 4 story building plus the attic. And where I had my camera was at like an L intersection. And so the building went down to the left there as far as it went that way. And if I was standing in here, I'd be about this high in this massive attic space. But this building, the only thing it's used for today is a few offices on the first floor, because it would cost too much to bring it up to code. They've got some other really nice buildings and a little pond on a really beautiful campus, so they've got some nice facilities. But when he took us up to this attic, it's just an absolutely amazing space. Been there for, 150 years. Down in New Harmony, there's a Working Man's Institute, and they've got a regular library today as well as a historical library. And on the second floor, they've got an authentic 19th century museum with stuffed animals and shell collections and arrowheads and all kinds of stuff. And we got in their attic, and it was just like you'd expect a 19th century museum's attic to look. There were ratty old stuffed animals and dental tools and books and statues of people and all these spinning wheels and farm implements. we really felt privileged to be able to visit some of these places that most people don't get to see. So over in Greene County, I think this is like the second longest railroad bridge in the country. It's about a half-mile long. And I had taken a picture of it, and Lynn said, well, I think I hear a train. And I said, well, I don't think there's a train. They only go through once a day. But then I heard the train. So I got my camera back out and got it set up on the tripod and just waited till the train came along and got its picture. You know, if you build a park pavilion today, it's probably going to be 4x4 posts and a sheet metal roof with no character at all. This is in Garfield Park on the south side of Indianapolis. You know, this is going to be saved for a while just because it's so special. Park pavilions today, they're going to last 20 years and they'll be torn down and nobody will care because they were just junk. This is the storeroom at the Masonic Lodge down in Bedford. I just thought this was really a neat picture with the chair in the foreground and the light reflecting. These cabinets over here have got all kinds of the old Masons uniforms in them with the big plumed hats and all, which he said they don't use these anymore, but those were all left behind when somebody moved away or died. Now, I don't know what the hook is for, but you look up at these buildings, there's just really neat carvings, faces, animals, details. Nobody notices this stuff. This is it's right above the entry door of the courthouse down in Princeton. And I just thought it was nice that this tongue was being spit out at all the politicians that enter there every day. This is in the Knights of Pythias Lodge in Shelbyville. It's on the second floor going up to the third floor. And the guy that took us in here said that, you know, the upper levels hadn't been used in 50 years. The second floor had several offices. It said like lawyer and accountant and things on the glass. And you go upstairs and there's this huge ballroom with a crystal chandelier and all this peeling paint. Just really, really neat spaces. So if you can get into these upper levels of these old buildings, they're just really, really neat. This is on the IU campus. It's a second floor classroom building. We'd seen this Venetian blind from the outside, and it was a Saturday and there was nobody having class today, so we got in and took this picture. But I really like this because I'm a Purdue graduate. Purdue has good, solid Venetian blinds. As we were driving around visiting all these towns that we hadn't been before and crossing them off on our map, we're between Vincennes and Terre Haute, and we knew the little town of Murrum was up ahead because it was on our map. And we could see this tower reaching up above the tall trees from 5 miles away. We thought, there's something pretty cool up there. So we got into Murrum, a little bitty town, and there's this huge building that was a college, another Civil War era building. And it's owned by a religious group now, and they have camp there and meetings and things. So we stopped and asked if we could take some pictures. And this woman said, well, we've got 13-year-old girls running around here. We're not about to let a man walk around taking pictures. Well, I could understand that. So she gave me the director's name, and I called him up in a few days, and he said, yeah, I think I've got something you'd like to take some pictures of. So we made a special trip clear over there, and he took us up the entry steps into the building, and there's all this cheap quarter-inch wall paneling on the walls. It'd been remodeled in the 1950s, and the paint was like an antiseptic green, and there's cheap carpet that needed replacing 20 years ago. And I thought, well, this is a real dump. What'd we drive all the way over here for? So we got on the elevator, and he took us up to the top floor and got off, and here's some more of this ugly paneling and cheap carpet. And he opened the doors into the attic. And this is in the attic. And it's 2 stories high. It goes clear up to the cupola that we had seen from 5 miles away above the trees. It's got names carved in it and dates. He said they'll often take parents and children up here that haven't been to camp here before. And this mother with her daughter were up here, and the mother said, "Now I want you to come over here." She pointed up above a doorway to her daughter, and she said, "That's your grandfather's name." So their family had been coming here for camp for a long time. But he said, "I was welcome to go up to the top if I wanted to take some pictures of the countryside." And I said, "Well, I'm afraid of heights." And he said, "You're doing a book called Second Stories, and you're afraid of heights?" And I said, "Well, yeah, but I'm going to give it a try." So I got about halfway, and this thing is just rocking back and forth, something terrible. He said, "Oh, it's safe, it's safe." I had no reason to doubt him, but I could only hold on with one hand while my other hand held on to the camera. So if I'd go up a step, I'd have to let go with this hand and hold on up here. And I only made it halfway, and I decided I'd just take some pictures from the bottom looking up at it. You know, they'd never build a Coca-Cola bottling plant like that. You just wouldn't spend that extra money to do anything that special today. Well, as we were driving around, it didn't take long to notice that the tallest things in these small towns were grain elevators. And just really quick, we decided grain elevators had to be a book of their own. And right away, I knew who I wanted to write the foreword for this. I just thought, Birch Bayh, our former senator. He grew up on a farm. He's got a soft spot in his heart for Indiana. So I waited a few months before I contacted him because I wanted to have enough pictures to give him an idea what we were doing. And I sent an email to his office, got no reply, so I called, talked to his secretary, and she said, "Well, Senator Bayh does not use a computer. He just doesn't like them." So I said, "Well, what if I just mailed some books and some sample images and whatever, and a letter and all?" I said, that'd be good. So a couple weeks later, I got a phone call. It says, "This John?" I said, "Yeah, this is Birch Bayh." He's one of my heroes. I was very pleased to talk to him. But he just really got into writing the foreword because he talked about growing up in the shadow of the grain elevator and how it helped form him as a human being. So this is the book. We covered the whole state for this, got leads of about 500 elevators, and ended up shooting at about half of them because some of them were gone. Some of them were replaced by something new that really wasn't very photogenic. But there were a lot of old ones still around. We found about 5 or 6 in the very process of being knocked down while we shot them. This is a camera I use. It's a 645 Mamiya camera. The 645 is the negative size. It's about 3 times as big as a 35 millimeter negative, so I can get some decent sized enlargements without them being real fuzzy. I almost always use a tripod because like inside exposures are sometimes as long as a minute because they're so dark in some of these places. This lens I use a lot for buildings. It's called a shift lens. You can turn this knob and this front part of the lens moves up and down. And what that allows you to do is change the perspective of what you're looking at. Normally, if you look up at a building with your eyes or with a camera, the building gets narrower at the top because of the perspective. That's the way it looks. And sometimes you want that because you can show, it emphasizes how tall some of these things are. 10, 12, 15 stories sometimes. But what that lens allows you to do is if this had a little bit of taper to it, it would look a little disturbing. So that lens allows you to straighten it up. It distorts the picture a little bit to where everything is parallel with the world. This elevator is really unusual and it's made out of clay tile. We only found 3 of them made out of clay tile. It was just too expensive a way to go. But they really look kind of neat. For those of you who didn't grow up on a farm, and I certainly didn't, the way these places work is you drive up onto a scale, and whoever's in the office gives you a weight, it's a full load of grain. You drive either, in this case, inside here, and you dump your grain. And there's a receiving pit underneath here, and the grain goes down there. And then a grain elevator is a device that lifts grain. It takes it out of that pit, it raises it up to the top, and then it dumps it into different tubes which go down into storage bins. So you can walk around on the first floor, and this is all storage here, and then there's mechanical stuff up above. And then when the grain is ready to be shipped away, there's another elevator that pumps it out and runs it out these tubes to, in this case, a railroad or other trucks or something. But look how big these beams are. We also shot some feed mills. A grain elevator is like a middleman. They buy the grain from the farmer and then they sell it to somebody else. A feed mill buys the grain from a farmer and grinds it, maybe mixes vitamins or minerals or mixes several different kinds of grain, and then they sell it for animal feed. And these are 3 different feed grinders. This is actually at a grist mill, the Adams Mill. We shot a few grist mills here. So a grain elevator is a middleman, a feed mill is a processor. And some of these places do both. They are primarily an elevator, but they also grind feed. Some of them used to be an elevator and they aren't anymore. Now they're a feed store. So they're kind of similar but different. And feed mills often have grain elevators in them, but you don't call them grain elevators, you call them feed mills. I particularly like the interiors with, because they're very utilitarian. There's nothing extra to them. Besides a grain elevator, there's an elevator for people in a lot of these, but they call them a man lift. They're for the man to ride up and down. You could climb a ladder, but it's a long way up there. This is a man lift. You open this gate, you step on a little platform. The platform has a steel cable that goes clear up to the top and over a pulley and is hooked to a counterweight. There's also a hemp rope tied to the floor and tied to the ceiling that goes through a hole in the floor of the man lift. The rope doesn't move. So when you step on the platform, you put your foot on the brake and that releases the brake. So you're free to move now. So if you take your foot off the brake, it stops. You put your foot on the brake and you just kind of gently pull on that hemp rope and you just glide right up. And it's kind of like being on a teeter-totter. You're never in perfect balance, but you're pretty close to balance, and you just glide up or you glide down, depending on whether you're a little bit heavier or a little bit lighter than the counterweight. But once these are abandoned, they cut the steel cable so nobody can play on those. This is looking up through the center of all the storage bins, and in this case, the man lift rides inside here, and these metal containers here are what houses the elevator mechanism. There's a continuous loop of reinforced rubber that's got little scoops on it, and it scoops up the grain at the bottom, and each scoop lifts it to the top, dumps the grain, and then the scoops travel upside down to the bottom, and then it just keeps going. So that's why it's called a grain elevator. There's a lot of rust and peeled paint in these places. I like to go in them when I can, but there was a deputy sheriff walking around here this day, and even though the door was open, I decided that wasn't a good place to go trespassing. He was looking for some evidence. He had been chasing somebody, and they lost a shoe, and he was trying to find the shoe. He was walking around looking for it, and I don't know what kind of evidence that shoe would have been, but he was still looking when we left. A lot of signs. Manufacturers will give you a free sign. Fairbanks scales are popular. Big old hawking thing, just huge. And you just think of how many people were usually around here in its heyday, just talking about, what seed to use, and was anybody get a new tractor, or whatever. And they just walked away. It's just abandoned now. For my next project, I'm working on old businesses that are abandoned, everything from general stores to factories. This was a little barber shop in the little town of Couts. You know, all these little towns had barber shops, and you just can't find them there anymore. This is the Studebaker factory in Fort Wayne, or in South Bend. And this was building 78. I don't know how many buildings they had, but they had at least 78. This is 4 stories, so there was 4 floors on either side of this open area, and they have these little balconies sticking out. And this is a big, massive crane that moved back and forth. There was a railroad track at the bottom. And you can just imagine how much activity there was here. You know, this crane lifting stuff off here and moving it over here, and just probably hundreds of people in this place, all working away. This got knocked down about a month after I shot it. They're just clearing this whole property. The guy that showed me inside this little root beer stand, he said, we've still got the retail merchant certificate on the wall from the last year this was operation. And it said 1962. And the keg is still sitting there. It's my last slide. And it's to remind you that the gift shop has my books for sale. And they make excellent Christmas gifts. And they're already autographed, so you know they're going to be worth a fortune when I'm dead. And I do plan on dying someday, just not right away. Okay, has anybody got any questions?
Microphone if you want a question.
After my exhibit is done here next month, it's going to the Indiana State Museum in Indianapolis for 4 months. So if you know anybody in Indianapolis that would like to see it, it'll be up there then. And after that, it'll be at the Evansville Central Library for about 2 months. So if you know anybody down there. And I give these presentations all over the state. So if you look on our website of studioindiana.com, if you know somebody in some other part of the state that would like a slide presentation, have them check it out. Thank you very much.
John, thank you so much for a thought-provoking, pleasant program. This was a wonderful evening. Please realize there's still refreshments if you want some more before you leave. Thank you so very much for coming. And I want to thank the 2 young men from the CATS, the Community Access Television Services, for filming this program. And also thank the students who have already left. But there were 7 students, I believe, from IU, from one of James Farmer's service learning courses who helped with the setup and the refreshments tonight. So thanks again for coming. Please come back.